Welcome. My name is Ann Kirschner, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today to our panel. I hope our title intrigues you. Will the grandkids go to college? I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists in just a minute, but I wanted to start by summarizing some of the trends that inspired that speculative question. This panel was put together pre-COVID, but what we saw way back when, last March, was that traditional higher education has been under pressure for a long time when you look at some of the key metrics, like declining college enrollment. When you look at it over the last 10 years or so, the graph kind of looks like this. Declining public confidence in the value of higher ed, concern about rising tuition, student debt, the disconnect between careers and education, low graduation rates. And you can certainly see this in some of the recent surveys around the prospective learners who are worried about whether education is really worth the cost, whether education will really help them get a good job. The numbers are troubling there as well. And even if those two trends, declining enrollment and declining public confidence, weren't happening, changing demographics certainly does not favor higher ed. When you look at the population changes that are coming down the pike, the demographics do not favor higher ed as well. So that was all true way back when, and then came COVID. It's a commonplace these days that COVID accelerated trends, but for higher education, it's had a particularly corrosive impact as it forcibly decoupled the classroom experience from the face-to-face aspects of a learning community. So all of that makes this discussion all the more timely. So with that as background, I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves and to tell us not only a little bit about what they're up to, but also to tell us about a powerful moment in their own education. So let me start alphabetically with Maria Anguiano.
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everyone. Maria Anguiano. I am the Senior Vice President for Enterprise Strategy and Planning at Arizona State University. So I spend my days thinking about the future of education and ways of making education more affordable, more accessible, more flexible, and just thinking about where to invest in order to serve the most learners. I have a background in finance, whether it's in the private sector, ed tech startups, public higher education. So that's a little bit about me. I think when I talk about why it's so important for me to focus on access to education, it kind of leads me to your question, Anne, about what was a powerful moment. I think people take access to education perhaps for granted. And for me, that was very much the point until I was in 4th grade and we were growing up in LA and we basically couldn't afford to live in the US anymore. And so my mom moved us, so she was a single mom. She moved us to Tijuana, Mexico, which is right across the border in San Diego. And so I had to basically cross the border every day to go to 4th grade. And so that was, I would say, an hour on good days and 2 hours on bad days, every single day, back and forth, just to get access to elementary school education because it wasn't available in Mexico. You had to pay for it. And we, again, couldn't afford to pay for it. And so I think since that moment, I realized how lucky and privileged we are here in the US to have access to education and how important it is and how that can make such a difference in someone's lives. So that's what makes me motivated to pursue this passion in education access.
Thank you. That's so powerful. Let's turn next to Leah Belsky.
Absolutely. So good to meet you all. My name is Leah. I'm the Chief Enterprise Officer at Coursera, and I spend my days working with a team that partners with global universities, with companies, and with governments, working with these institutions to try and upskill and reskill the labor force. And I'll share a moment. It's actually not personal, but it felt very personal. It's actually a year ago now. At Coursera, we end up having companies and governments from all over the world come to our headquarters when we were all sitting in Mountain View. That's no longer the case, and visit us. And one of the most memorable visits was actually from a delegation from South Africa. It was a delegation from the Ministry of Education. And, we had this conversation about how they could improve the higher education system. And then towards the end of the meeting, the head of the meeting sat down and he said, you know, you should realize that what you're doing isn't just about quality. It isn't about skills. Every year when we open the universities in South Africa, people riot in front of the front doors and they are crushing as a mob to get in. And we've had years where people actually died trying to get into the university doors. And it's a conversation that stayed in my mind because it made me really appreciate what summits like ASU GSV is about and what it really means to try and bring technology into education.
Education worth dying for. Okay, two powerful stories. Brandon, can you match that?
Definitely can't compete with those, but it's great to see everybody. Really excited to be part of this panel. I work for Kaplan. I lead our university-based work where we try to help diversify and grow mission-driven revenue for our university partners. And I also lead our Learn Work Innovation, which is really sitting at the intersection of work and education. So I love my job. I have a ton of fun. The educational experience that I was going to share is a personal one. One of the most memorable assignments and the toughest assignments I've ever had was the very first homework assignment in Alma Blunt's class during my junior year of college, where she asked us to write a paper about our purpose in life. And that one I still refer to often. That was easily the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also one that really helped clarify a lot, not just what I was doing in college, but a long-term vision. And I'm forever grateful for her challenging us in those ways.
The power of a great teacher never fails to change lives. Thank you, Brandon. And over to you, John.
Hi, great to see everybody. I'm John Fillmore. I'm the president of Chegg Skills, which is our division at Chegg focused on learning to earning. So how are we actually making sure our students and others have the skills necessary for a good middle class job? For me, it very much is actually aligned to that. My powerful moment was, I can still remember the day that I got the letter saying I had a full academic scholarship to the University of Oregon, because up until that day, it was very much a question of whether or not I could go to college. We certainly were not in the space to afford it with a single mom with 4 boys. And so for me, kind of thinking of that as the ticket to the American dream, the ticket to a middle class lifestyle, that was the day that the doors kind of opened.
Wow. Actually, all I really want to do is now ask you questions about those great stories, but we will move along. Thank you, John. So I thought we'd start out with the specific question that this panel was focused on, which was, when you look down 20 years, will that grandchild go to college? I have somewhat of an advantage over all of you because I actually do have a grandchild. But use your imagination. It was kind of hard for the ASU GSV people to do polls. So those of you who are listening to us, I hope you'll be thinking about your own point of view, and maybe you'll hear some things that will change it a little bit. And by the way, please ask us questions, because later on, if we have time, we'll do a little bit of Q&A. So look in your crystal ball. 20 years hence, do you think my darling grandson is going to go to college? This one's up for anybody.
Well, I'm happy to start. And as a father of a 13-year-old daughter, I certainly hope in 20 years I am not answering the question of whether my grandkids are going to college. So hopefully we have a little bit longer. But I'll take the under on that one. Do I think that there are going to be some kids who are going to what we think of as a traditional college? For sure. I think you have smart schools like ASU that are going to figure out how to serve, a good quantity of people. But the reality of the stats, and you said some of them, but the one that's been most powerful to me is, if you look back 7 years ago, 74% of 18 to 29-year-olds thought it was critically important to have a college education in this country. In 7 short years, that has gone down to 41%. So it has dropped in half. And I'd be willing to bet in 5 years it's gone down further. And the reason is most people realize, do I need a higher education? Do I need some sort of training and skills to be able to start getting into that next rung of the economic ladder? Yes. Do I need to be $200,000 poorer in order to do that? No. And I think, frankly, for the future of our country, hopefully the answer is no.
Yeah, I think those stats are pretty compelling. Anyone want to add to that?
I'll jump in. I'll say that I think if we do our job well, the answer will be yes. And I mean college in the sense of a journey of discovery and learning, not necessarily the residential experience. In fact, that's very rare for even students today. We don't have to look 20 years in the future to know that students are trying to access higher education in lots of different ways today. But I think that learning, not just higher education, but even lifelong learning will be something that will even be more prevalent in the next 20 years. And our job is to figure out how to make it flexible and affordable for students to be able to experience and have access to that education.
Absolutely. So college may look different from how it looks now, but the need for lifelong learning is going to increase, definitely not decrease. But most students who go to college today say that they're going, it may be a declining number, but those who are still going are viewing it as a stepping stone to a good job. So Brendan, let me turn to you for this question. Do you feel like college in the future will continue to be the primary pathway to that first good job? And is higher ed doing enough to make that connection?
Look, I agree with John and Maria. If we're talking about degree-seeking students, we've shed 2.5 million degree-seeking students across higher ed in the last 10 years, right? So the real evidence is that it's trending downward. But if we broaden our lens in what we mean by going to college, right, whether that's online, whether that's a non-traditional age student, non-residential student, doing college through an employer program because it's part of my employer benefit. There are a lot of different ways that we might experience college, including, of course, all the different non-degree educational opportunities that are very in demand right now. Industry recognized credentials, certificate programs, faster upskilling and reskilling programs that employers are very eager to offer and that employees or folks who are unemployed are eager to get into. So, when I think about it, I think there's going to be far fewer students going to traditional college in the form of a residential program. I think the other thing you'll start to see, we've talked about, various ways that people might experience college or be served by college. We're also going to see interesting versions of it, like instead of the flipped classroom, I think you're going to see flipped calendars. What do I mean by that? You're going to be able to go online in the fall and the spring semester and then have a residential opportunity in the summer. That's going to be, yet another variety of this. So I think we're going to see higher education become a very, very diverse set of offerings that will expand far beyond degrees, far beyond residential. But if you just look at the core enrollments in degree-seeking programs in traditional universities, we might have a 20-year consecutive decline there. We've been on a decline for 10. And if you forecast out another 10 years, especially with the population age demographic in the US, we could have a 20-year decline in degree-seeking enrollment. So we're already halfway there.
Yeah, it's exciting but scary. Leah?
No, I would jump in. I would agree with John. I think what's most interesting, particularly in this moment, is that higher education is just changing so rapidly, both in the ways that Maria was describing. What's been interesting the past few months is we've had a front row seat to see how universities are reacting when they have to go online, and then what they're doing when they can't go online rapidly. And one of the big trends that we've been seeing is that, unlike the traditional model where every university had its own faculty, they all taught Psychology 101, they all taught, the same basic courses, we're seeing a lot more collaboration among universities. And from a Coursera vantage, we made our entire catalog available to the world as soon as COVID hit. And so we saw over 4,000 universities all around the world, actually more like 10,000, adopting the platform. So all of a sudden you would have universities in Cameroon, in Nairobi, in South Africa, taking courses and credentials built by Google or by IBM or by University of Michigan and making them part of the core offering. And like John was saying, a lot of these offerings are short-term programs. They're not necessarily going to apply to a degree. but they do allow people to go to college in a different way. And so I think we're really at the beginning of an exciting moment where what higher education is going to be reinvented.
I'm really heartened by hearing you say that, because I confess that I haven't seen that much evidence of collaboration amongst American universities, where it's still too darn hard to transfer from one school to another. And what I hear a lot in university land is higher ed thinking that it will all go back to normal. So it's okay to have all these stopgap efforts, but really what we're waiting for is to turn the corner and have the virus and everything will be just fine. So, maybe I'm a little too gloomy about it, but I haven't quite seen the signs of what you're describing yet. So I'm excited to hear that. John, let me ask you a question about quality assurance. Down the road. There's the accrediting agencies these days. In some ways, employers are the ultimate quality assurance. How do you see that playing out in the future?
I think the second one you hit ends up being the ultimate QA. It's the employer. If I was, taking the point Brandon made of, the 10 years as it becomes 20, I think this actually starts accelerating a lot more in terms of people moving away when you have more companies like Google and Microsoft and Amazon. And I think that's going to kind of filter through saying, we don't necessarily need a degree. We're going to have assessments that help us understand, do you have the skills necessary to get into the front part of this job? And whether you got that skill on Thinkful, or whether you got that skill at Coursera, or whether you got that skill at Arizona State or Southern New Hampshire, we don't really care. We just want to know that you're a team player and that you know the basics that we can work with. That moment is a lot faster than I think, unfortunately, a lot of our university friends are thinking. And I think it's going to be a game changer.
Yeah, and some of the companies you've mentioned are already removing college degree required from their job descriptions, which is a little bit of a canary in the coal mine. While we're talking about the evolving role of employers, Leah, let me turn to you. You've had so much experience with working with employers. Tell us a little bit about what you see as the pros and cons of employers shaping education.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I actually held a panel yesterday about employers as educators with Ken Eisner, who leads global education at Amazon, and asked that question. I think on the pro side, higher education has been very slow to bring in skills-based learning and to methodically figure out how to produce courses that allow people to learn the technologies of the future, skills of the future. And so companies have stepped in a very meaningful way. For a while it was research collaborations where research projects were funded or software was given out. And now we're seeing companies taking a much more active role building programs that are actually distributed through universities. And I think it's a net positive, because the truth is, if you want to learn how to be a cloud engineer, if you want to learn how to be a cloud architect, why not learn from someone like a Google or an Amazon or an IBM? I think the concern is that that's not all that education is about. And so it'll be up to the higher education community to both reinvent itself so it can provide these skills-based learning and collaborate with companies, but also step back and think about, what is also the core of what we want people to learn within an educational institution. Is there something about citizenship and values and, some of the things we might have liked to see from our leaders last night at the debate, that we hope that educational institutions would collaborate. And I would not expect that to come from companies per se. But I'm actually really hopeful about the role that companies can play in helping upgrade the global higher education system.
I could practically hear, if we were doing this at an academic conference, some faculty members, their hair would be standing on end, and they would be saying, well, critical thinking and what happened to the traditional liberal arts model, and but let me sort of reframe it. Is there a danger in education becoming too practical? In the good year 2020, and I use good year sarcastically, we learned the essential arts of improvisation, innovation, doing things in new ways. agility is essential, right? Because the world just changes so quickly, and anybody who doesn't believe that must have been sleeping for the last year. So how do we learn how to navigate the unexpected? And Maria, maybe this ties into something you and I have talked about, the cohort model. Where will future students, if they're not going to get it from employers, where are they going to get that social, emotional intelligence? You know, we're heading towards an AI-filled future, so the soft skills, which I hate, you know, executive skills or cognitive skills, communication, empathy, creativity, collaboration, leadership, where's that all going to come from?
Yeah. So, Anna, I would separate it actually into two categories. There's the very hard skills of being a problem solver, a master communicator. To me, those are hard skills. And then there's the soft skills. Do you know how to, and that tend to be more practical, collaboration, teamwork? How do you, even basic skills, like how do you write a resume? How do you go to an interview? So I think the cohort model, especially for our first generation students, provides a lot of that. And because one of the reasons when we talk about, well, why aren't folks going to higher ed, or why are we losing folks, is people need to see the intentionality of how college is going to get into their either career goals or life goals, right? And so part of the cohort model, like I said, especially for our first generation students, is this a lot of times, at least the students that we have at ASU Local in Los Angeles, the first time they've known anyone that's going to college, right? And so the coaches that we provide for them are supporting them in every aspect of their lives, whether it's figuring out their budget, figuring out how they're going to get to campus, figuring out how to sign up for a course, figuring out how to get financial aid, all those things, and creating community so that folks feel like they have a support network that's helping them get through college, because it's very, very difficult. It's difficult for students that are working 30 hours a week, who don't know anyone in their family that's ever gone to college, to make it through education. And so that cohort model really provides a support system and a community to help them make it through and get to their goals.
Yeah, it's so important. There's a program at the City University of New York, which is where I spent part of my day job, that doubled the graduation rates in 2-year colleges when they provided that sort of surround sound for students and helping them through the day.
But can I ask, and Maria, you know, sounds like you may have some experience around this as well. This is, you know, coming from more of like public housing as a background. Like, do you really need to learn that through your college though? Like, I'm going to sound crass, but in all honesty, like the drug dealers who lived next door to me were probably better salesmen and communicators than like 80% of the developers I worked with, right? Because they learned that, frankly, through necessity. Like my mom was more innovative and agile than most of the people I've ever met in my life. And that woman, you know, barely graduated high school because her parents wanted to put her on the farm before she could do it. Like, I just think there's this element of when we say it's got to come through college. And Maria, I mean, no offense to the program you're doing, you're doing it because you care about your students and you're seeing that a lot of them need this help. The question is just really, does it have to come from that university? Or can it come from life experience? Or can it come from other programs that, you know, employers with a university can provide as people start to get in the door?
Yeah. I think for folks perhaps, so for 18-year-olds, for folks right out of high school, I think it should come from college. Otherwise, sure, it'll come from life experience after they've failed for 5, 6, 7 years and now decided they're going to try again at 25, but we could have solved the issue at 18, right? And so, sure, no, it doesn't have to come from college, but I think public higher education can play a big role in helping keep folks, you know, on track, starting without losing track or without having to meander back and figure it out. We can catch them as soon as they graduate from high school, or hopefully even before that, and have it be a really seamless path.
Yeah, no, John, I think you raise an interesting question, and it goes back to Anne's point about what the role of higher education is. You know, we've had an interesting experience recently. So a year ago, we launched what we call a Gateway Certificate Program. It was a program with Google, specifically that would enable someone to start with no educational background, no college background, and get a a full-time job as an IT professional. And it was about a 9-month program. We had over 300,000 people enroll, and we also distributed it through nonprofit partners. And towards the end, we started surveying people on, was this impactful? And one of the biggest reasons that students gave feedback why they didn't get interviews or why they weren't able to get jobs was this soft skills. And I think, we all know that. We know the importance of soft skills, but I think if higher education doesn't do a good job, and I'm not even sure that we do a good job of it now, right? How many schools really do a good job teaching people to lead or to collaborate? I mean, I went to law school at like a fancy law school. They didn't do any of the soft skills training that one would have needed to be successful in the workforce. But what's exciting, and I think what's even exciting at this COVID moment, I've never heard so much discussion about how social emotional components are missing from education. And so I think there may actually even be more focus on teaching these types of skills in higher education.
I mean, we have 15 million students on our platform, and we ask all the time, where do they need the most support? And consistently in the top 5 is these skills that help me be qualified for the job. And it's not the traditional hard skills, do I know to code? It's the, how do I interview? How do I communicate? How do I show that I'm ready?
Yeah, I think you guys are all touching on one of the things that I think has been one of the biggest results of the pandemic, which is education consumers starting to dissect and analyze all the different components of education, right? Think about it through the college lens. Are colleges a place where I go to just get away from home and live in residence halls? Is it the education that's really what I'm paying for? Is it the diploma that I get that's the signaling factor in the marketplace, right? Is it all the other support systems that are part of it, especially when you think about programs for underserved students? A lot of the things that move the needle are a lot of those emotional and physical and other mental health and safety supports that go behind it, not necessarily the content that they're being taught in the classroom. And so you're starting to say, okay, which of those things do I value most? How much of the X dollar price tag do I assign to this one versus this one versus this one? And you do start asking questions like you have, John. Do I have to get those things from college? Is college the only place that I can get it? So I don't think that we're ever going back, on that perspective, right? Education consumers just being much more discerning and analytical about all the different components of it. We've been talking a long time about the unbundling of higher education. The pandemic is definitely accelerating the unbundling.
I couldn't agree more. First of all, that there's a kind of hubris to higher education to claim that, we're the people who teach the soft skills when actually we don't. But I also want to pick up on Brandon's point, which is that we haven't tended to be very intentional, to use your word, Maria. We haven't really thought that much about the component parts of higher education. And even the factor of, we're all curious people. We all have learned how to learn. We are, I have a PhD in English, which I've never used, right? I mean, it's just, I do everything I do, and it has absolutely nothing to do with what I went to graduate school for. And that's because somewhere along the line, I learned how to learn. Well, how did I learn how to learn? And how do I teach other people how to learn how to learn? I mean, that's just it's a real black box. And COVID has lifted the lid on the black box. So I couldn't agree more. One of the questions that's coming in from the audience, which I think is relevant, gets to the question of degrees. Brandon, you mentioned the word signaling. Will universities continue to award degrees, or do you believe they will be more competency or more certificate driven? What does the world look like in the future? How do we prove we know what we know? Employers have, more or less accepted a college degree as a proxy for a certain kind of competence. Oh, you have a college degree, that must mean you know something. I think those days are over too. So where's credentialing going?
Well, John mentioned employer validation, right? I think employers are effectively becoming a new kind of accreditor for higher education. And, where they value training that is being done by a higher ed institution or another educational training provider, where it moves the needle on productivity, retention, right? Whatever metrics that they might be tracking as key outcome metrics, that's going to be a validator. I think individual students themselves are going to be validators, right? One of the things that we've done really little progress on is creating a measure of the performance of higher education. You know, all the different rankings are essentially metrics that have nothing to do with the personal experiences and evaluations of the students who have gone through the experience. And so, you know, this is something obviously, John, you guys have learned a lot about at Che. You've listened to customers very, very carefully, right? You've listened to students. They're helping validate the future of higher education when we listen to them and when we listen to them carefully. So I think the quality control is going to be through the lens of employers and the individual students or consumers themselves. And one of the areas where I am skeptical actually is universities creating more and more certificates, right? The growth and the badging movement. I'm a big fan of the concept, but what happens is it takes a long time for an individual badge issued by an individual university to gain any kind of credibility or visibility, right? I am a huge proponent of industry recognized credentials because they have a validator, meaning on the other end, a group of employers, an association of employers. So as much as I like shorter forms of education, I'm a big fan of it. I worry that we got a proliferation of badges and certificates that may not move the needle in value in terms of the signal value, the employer value. So that's where there's going to be a lot of sifting out in the market. Some will rise up like an Eagle Scout, right? Has, you know, if you see an Eagle Scout on a resume, people still go, wow, that's, you know, but very few are going to reach that level where they have their own kind of brand and credibility if it's not driven by employer recognized standards.
Let me touch on that a little bit with something that concerns me, which is when you think about graduate education and research, those are huge parts of what universities give to society. So you know, if we're headed towards this unbundled world, and maybe this time it's really happening. Think, for instance, about the education of doctors. If college is unpacked, what happens to the most complex ladders of learning? What happens to the university as the home of those kinds of credentials and also of research?
I think you'll start to see it unbundle as well, right? The reality is, you know, if you look at I'll use an MIT or a Purdue or an Arizona State, this was a big deal at Oregon when I went to Oregon. There's an extraordinary amount of value that can be created out of that research. It's just that it is seen when these schools that oftentimes pitch, and I've been a part of that pitch working for Governor Schwarzenegger's office, they come in and they say, look at all the value we've given back to the state by doing this research. The reality is you can also get that value out by owning a piece of a company. You can get that value out by licensing the patent out or the research out. You have more and more schools like MIT doing this. You know, the reality is the best schools will think about ways to innovate and to monetize the things that they're creating value on. When you start to lose the, hey, it's immediately worth $200,000 that I gave you a piece of paper that said you had a degree from Oregon or Oregon State or wherever else. It's not to make fun of any particular college. It's just that not every college provides the same level of quality of education.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with John. It's not just about unbundling. I don't actually think that it makes sense necessarily for higher education to include both the job of educating people as well as producing knowledge. You know, I started my career at NIH, one of the biggest research hubs in the US, and came from a research university where I had the privilege of learning from the best researchers in the world. And, you know, we all know the best researchers aren't necessarily the greatest teachers. And so I do think the unbundling will cause a lot of breakup there, but I'm not sure it's a bad thing for society writ large. And I'm not, you know, for some institutions, it will for sure create a crisis of what is the primary value that they want to put out in the world. But for the vast majority of universities in the world, they're not research institutions. And so in some ways, you know, the research institutions can continue and figure out their path. If we figure out their role and how to upgrade and help the rest of global institutions and just leave those research institutions aside, that's where most people are going to get educated. And I think that's the sets of institutions that can really have an impact in the world.
The reality is for the
sorry,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, just as, you know, our economy moves forward, how many of you like we're educated for the current job that you're doing now, right? The inquiry-based process of creating new knowledge is basically a core skill set that everyone will need in the future. And so I actually think that the education that research universities can produce, because not all of them do it, not all of them do it intentionally, and so I will acknowledge that, but if you are intentional about it, learning how to do research and how to create new knowledge is actually a very valuable, employable skill.
Sure, sure. Another question from the audience. What are the thoughts from this panel on the role of alumni associations being reinvented or replaced as companies now offer alumni programs that give that longer term network and social capital? I guess I'd like to sort of massage that question a little bit and talk about the networking function of higher education and whether those balances are also changing as we change the integration of careers and education. Any thoughts on that?
I'll quickly say there's a little bit of a myth of the alumni, networking phenomenon. One of the studies I was involved with when I was at Gallup showed that less than a quarter of graduates have ever tapped into their alumni network for the purposes of trying to find an internship. So first of all, we've greatly underutilized alumni networks. Obviously, big variation between an Ivy League school and a regional university in terms of the activity and involvement. But look, we've all talked about lifelong learning, and lifelong learning actually shows up as the most common word in university mission statements. But we have not delivered on that, right? And I think we need structural ways to invite alumni to be students always, right? And I think there's going to be some real innovations in terms of how that starts to play out across higher education. So that's one of the areas that I'm most excited is that, the concept of I'm always a student, right? Okay, let's memorialize that. Instead of being students and alumni, right? Like, why not just be a student? Why not be enrolled in an evergreen degree program that I never actually graduate from because I'm constantly enrolled in it? Because every year it's bringing me fresh new insights that keep me on the cutting edge of my cybersecurity job or my cloud computing job or my job in higher education. So.
Wow, less than a quarter have ever contacted their, that's a pretty powerful statistic. Okay, so we're about 5 minutes from wrapping up this panel. I'd like to ask you all to think about, first of all, whether you think the lessons from COVID will be long-lived, which ones will remain, maybe all of them, maybe none of them. And then what trends are you watching in ed tech or in higher ed that you think are noteworthy? And why don't we do it alphabetically again? Maria, can we start with you?
Yeah. No, I think some of the lessons, at least for higher education institutions, that will come out of COVID is the resilience of learners and educators. And to me, it's the knowledge and learning that how much more accessible education can be made through technology. Because I think ASU was there already and has been there for a long time, but I know many other institutions that did not trust technology, haven't figured out how to incorporate technology. And, while it doesn't replace the human element, there's so many ways that technology can enhance the experience and make it more accessible. We were talking about earlier today that I'm going to listen to a lot of these sessions in my own time. I don't have to show up to a certain place at a certain time to get my education. And if I can't make it during that time, I've literally lost the ability to get that knowledge. That just seems so antiquated. And so I hope that that's a huge lesson for higher education institutions, is how do they incorporate this technology to make it as accessible to learners as possible?
That's great. Leah, over to you.
I think like Maria, I think one of the biggest lessons for higher education is really just going to be the adoption of technology. I think before COVID, this stat was something like higher ed spends about 5% of its budgets on IT, one of the lowest in any major industries. And that's going to be radically, radically different. I think the second thing that's going to be different is there's going to be much more focused on the skills-based education. I look at our own site, we had a 500% increase in traffic to the site. Schools were shut down and desperate students started to sample all different types of education. And I think that's going to significantly up the bar and the pressure on what students expect from education. And the trend I'm most focused on is to see how rapidly we see international universities, particularly in emerging markets, start adopting some of the best courses and start learning from some of the best professors in other markets. And I think that alone has a possibility of really transforming the education that happens globally. There's no reason why any student studying at a higher education, an institution of higher education, shouldn't have access to the very best course in data science, the very best courses in cloud. And that's just so different from the way, from what we see out there today. So I think that could change. There's a lot of resistance, but that could really be transformative as well.
Wonderful. Brandon?
I think it's going to become increasingly student-centered and also employer-linked, right? So there's going to be much more attention to how we serve the individual consumer, education consumer. They're going to influence more and more of what happens in terms of the services and offerings that are out there. And I think the one big shift that we're going to see is instead of people going to college to get a good job, which has always been the top #1 primary motivation, we are going to increasingly see, and this is true for traditional age students too, they're going to go get a job to get college because it's going to be embedded as part of their employer benefits program, upskilling, reskilling program. And so that would be my summary of what's going to happen.
Excellent. John, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I'm right there with Brandon on the student-centered, and I think what it's going to drive is a much deeper focus on what is that return on investment in education. And I'm excited. I think you're going to see leaders and innovators like Southern New Hampshire and ASU who reinvent what education means for them, and you're going to see a lot of these schools that just cease to be because they're still trying to build horse and buggies in the land of the Mustang.
Wow, couldn't be better to land on a Mustang. Thank you very, very much to our panelists. I think I can answer the question. My grandson will be a lifelong learner, whether he'll get that from college or not. Let's call it college, but really it's the gateway to learning that we need to be concerned about. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.
Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.